It's strange how certain nights stick with you, no matter how much time passes. This happened years ago, but every time I think about it, I feel the same cold dread crawling up my spine. At the time, I was driving back home after a long weekend visiting friends. The road I took was a rural highway, cutting through miles of dense forest. It was late, probably close to midnight, and the road was utterly deserted. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. I was halfway through the journey when my car started acting up. The engine sputtered, and the dashboard lights flickered ominously. Before I could process what was happening, the car gave out completely, rolling to a stop on the side of the road. I tried turning the ignition again and again, but the engine refused to start. My phone, of course, had no signal. I was alone, stranded in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the faint rustling of trees and the occasional hoot of an owl to keep me company. At first, I tried to stay calm, convincing myself that another car would pass by soon. But as the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, the oppressive silence of the forest started to weigh on me. Then I heard it. A faint sound, like someone calling my name. It was distant, almost like an echo carried by the wind. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I thought I must have imagined it, but then it came again, clearer this time. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. Only the wind. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't just a random noise, it was my name, unmistakably. The way it was said sent chills through me. It was calm, almost inviting, yet it filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin. The forest was pitch black, the trees forming an impenetrable wall of shadows. I strained my eyes, trying to see where the voice was coming from, but there was nothing. Just darkness. "Who's there?" I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. For a moment, everything went quiet again, and I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. But then the voice came once more, clearer and closer. It was coming from the trees. I took a step back, my heart pounding. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get back in the car, but my legs felt like lead. The voice called my name again, this time almost playful, like it was taunting me. I stumbled back to the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. My breath came in short gasps as I stared out into the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to appear. The voice stopped. For a moment, the silence was almost a relief. But then I felt it, a presence, just outside the car. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that whatever was calling me hadn't gone away. It was closer now, waiting. The silence outside the car was unbearable, pressing down on me like a weight. My breath fogged up the windows as I stared into the darkness, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. Then I saw it. A shadow shifted among the trees, barely visible in the faint moonlight. At first, I thought it was an animal, but as it moved closer, I realized it was standing upright, tall and human-like. It stopped just at the edge of the forest, as though waiting for me to notice it. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to see it more clearly. Its movements were unnatural, almost jerky, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. I couldn't make out any details, but the way it tilted its head, as though studying me, made my stomach twist in fear. And then the voice came again, this time louder and clearer than before. It wasn't coming from the figure itself, but from somewhere deep inside the forest, echoing through the trees. "Come closer," it said, still using my name. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay inside the car, but my curiosity, mixed with an overwhelming sense of dread, kept me frozen in place. The figure didn't move, but its presence felt suffocating, as if it were drawing the air out of the car. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. Eventually, I mustered the courage to turn on the car's headlights, hoping to scare it off. The beams illuminated the road ahead, but when I looked back toward the forest, the figure was gone. Or so I thought. I tried the ignition again, praying for a miracle. The engine sputtered and roared to life, and for a brief moment, relief washed over me. Without hesitation, I floored the gas pedal, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was lurking in the woods. But as I sped down the empty highway, the voice returned, louder than ever, echoing inside the car now. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was everywhere, surrounding me, filling my head. I glanced at the rearview mirror and nearly lost control of the car. The figure was standing in the middle of the road behind me, illuminated by my taillights. It didn't chase me, didn't move. It just stood there, watching, as though it knew I couldn't truly escape. The voice grew into a cacophony, overlapping whispers that made no sense but filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I felt like I was being pulled back, as if the car was struggling against an unseen force. Then, in the distance, I saw the faint glow of lights. A small village, its streetlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope. I pushed the car to its limits, the engine roaring as I raced toward the safety of the town. As soon as I crossed into the outskirts of the village, the voice stopped. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air felt normal again. I pulled into a small cafe parking lot, my hands trembling as I turned off the engine. I glanced back toward the road, half expecting to see the figure standing there. But the highway was empty, as though nothing had ever happened. I sat in the parking lot for what felt like an eternity, my body too shaken to move. The lights from the cafe cast a warm glow that felt out of place after the suffocating darkness of the highway. I could still feel the weight of the voice, its echo lingering in the back of my mind. Eventually, I mustered the courage to go inside. The place was nearly empty, save for an older man behind the counter and a young waitress cleaning a table. The smell of coffee and grease filled the air, grounding me in reality. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the man said, his tone half joking but laced with genuine concern. I hesitated, unsure if I should tell him what had happened. Would he even believe me? But the words spilled out before I could stop them. I told him about the car breaking down, the voice calling my name, and the figure in the woods. His expression shifted as I spoke, the humor in his eyes replaced by something darker. When I finished, he leaned against the counter and let out a long sigh. "You're lucky you made it here," he said, his voice low. "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach tightening. He looked around, as if to make sure no one else was listening. "That road, it's not normal. People have been talking about strange things happening out there for years. Voices calling your name, figures in the dark. Most who hear the voice don't make it out." His words sent a shiver down my spine. "What happens to them?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Depends," he said. "Some disappear completely. Others are found days later, wandering the woods, babbling nonsense. But no one's ever been able to explain it." I felt the weight of his words settle over me. Whatever had happened on that road wasn't just in my head. I stayed in the cafe until dawn, too afraid to return to the highway. The waitress brought me a cup of coffee on the house, her kind smile doing little to ease my nerves. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, I finally found the courage to leave. The older man offered me directions to a different route, one that would take me far from the cursed road. Before I left, he gave me a final piece of advice. If you ever hear your name in a place it shouldn't be, don't answer. Just keep walking. I nodded, his words etched into my memory. The drive home was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow on the side of the road made my pulse quicken, and I found myself glancing at the rearview mirror more often than necessary. Even now, years later, I can't forget that night. I avoid driving at night altogether, and I've never set foot on that highway again. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I think I can still hear it. My name, whispered softly, calling me back. It's been years since that night, but the memory still lingers in my mind, vivid and unsettling. At the time, I was living in a small, quiet town, a place where nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen. My life was routine, predictable. But that night changed everything. I had been working late and decided to walk home rather than wait for a bus. The air was cool, the streets were deserted, and the silence of the town felt unusually heavy. As I walked, the dim streetlights cast long, flickering shadows across the empty road. At first, the sound was faint, barely noticeable. A distant chime, soft and rhythmic, like church bells tolling far away. I stopped to listen, curious. It wasn't uncommon to hear bells from the old church in town, but this sounded different, uneven, as though the bells were struggling to keep a steady rhythm. I shrugged it off and kept walking, chalking it up to my tired mind playing tricks on me. But as I turned onto a narrower street, the sound grew louder, closer. The soft chimes now had an almost hypnotic quality, drawing me forward even though I didn't know why. As I followed the sound, I found myself turning onto an unfamiliar alley. The streetlights were dimmer here, casting the area in a pale, eerie glow. The bells were clearer now, each chime echoing off the walls of the narrow buildings. And then I saw him. In the middle of the alley, a tall figure stood perfectly still. He was dressed in dark, old-fashioned clothing, his face obscured by shadows. Something about his posture made my skin crawl. It was too rigid, too unnatural. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The bells seemed louder than ever, their sound reverberating inside my head. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. Slowly, I took a step back, then another. The figure remained motionless, but the weight of his gaze followed me. I turned and walked quickly back to the main road, my heart pounding. When I finally dared to glance over my shoulder, the alley was empty, or so I thought. A shadow moved in the corner of my vision, closer now. The figure hadn't stayed in the alley. He was following me. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness of the night. Every instinct told me to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the figure. Yet, no matter how fast I walked, the sound of the bells remained constant, as if they were following me. The streetlights above flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. I glanced back again, my breath hitching in my chest. The figure was still there, closer than before. He didn't walk, he didn't need to. Somehow he just was. I turned down another street, my mind racing. The town was small, but the streets could feel like a labyrinth in the dark. I hoped to find a busy road, somewhere lit and filled with people. But the farther I went, the quieter and darker it became. The bells grew louder, their chime echoing in my ears. My heart pounded as the weight of the sound pressed down on me. It wasn't just noise anymore, it was inside me, filling every corner of my mind, drowning out my thoughts. In my panic, I turned into a small park, hoping the open space would make me feel less trapped. Trees loomed overhead, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The shadows seemed alive, shifting and twisting in ways that defied logic. I stopped in the middle of the park, gasping for air. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my body too heavy to keep moving. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I felt it, the sensation of being watched, stronger than ever. Slowly I turned, and there he was, standing at the edge of the park, perfectly still, his figure silhouetted against the dim light of a distant street lamp. I didn't wait for him to move. My survival instincts kicked in, and I bolted toward the only place that seemed familiar, the alley where it all began. The bells rang louder with each step I took, a deafening cacophony that made it hard to think. My vision blurred as tears welled in my eyes, but I kept running. I reached the alley and collapsed against the cold brick wall, my chest heaving. The figure appeared at the entrance, his movements slow and deliberate. This time, he stepped forward, his feet making no sound against the pavement. The bells stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like the world had paused. I forced myself to stand, my back pressed against the wall. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised one hand, pointing directly at me. My body froze, a cold dread washing over me as the air around him seemed to ripple. Shadows swirled at his feet, reaching out toward me like tendrils of darkness. Desperation surged through me. I didn't know what he was, but I knew I couldn't let him touch me. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I screamed, a primal, guttural sound that echoed through the alley. The sound shattered the stillness, and for the briefest moment, the figure hesitated. The shadows recoiled, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted slightly. Taking advantage of the moment, I ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but the sight of the streetlights ahead gave me the strength to keep moving. The bells had stopped, but I could still feel their echo in my head, like a phantom sound refusing to let me go. The streetlights were brighter here, their glow cutting through the suffocating darkness that had followed me. As I stepped into the light, a strange sense of relief washed over me. It was as if I had crossed an invisible boundary, one that the figure couldn't follow. I turned back to look at the alley. It was empty. The figure was gone, as if he had melted into the shadows. My chest heaved as I tried to process what had just happened. The bells, the figure, the oppressive darkness. It all felt like a nightmare, but the sweat dripping down my face and the ache in my muscles told me it had been real. I stood there for a long time, staring at the alley, half expecting him to appear again. But the longer I stood under the bright streetlights, the more the oppressive feeling faded. Slowly, the world around me began to feel normal again. It took me days to fully recover from that night. Even now, I'm not sure I've truly moved on. I avoided that part of town entirely, never walking near that alley or the park again. The thought of hearing those bells still sends a shiver down my spine. I tried to find answers, asking a few older locals about strange occurrences in the area, but no one seemed to know anything. Or maybe they just didn't want to talk about it. Looking back, I can't explain what happened or why I was the one to experience it. I don't know who or what that figure was, but I know one thing. I'll never forget the sound of those bells. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I think I hear them again. Just faintly, as if they're calling me back. If you ever hear bells at midnight, don't follow them. Don't try to understand them. Because once you step into their world, you may never find your way out. I still remember the sound of those creaking rides, the faint hum of the carousel, and the eerie silence that blanketed the park after it closed. It's been years since I worked as a night guard at that old amusement park, but the memories remain vivid. The park wasn't grand or well-maintained. It was just a relic of its prime years, hanging on by nostalgia and fading lights. At the time, I was a young man, taking whatever job I could find to pay the bills. Working the night shift wasn't ideal, but it was quiet, predictable. My job was simple: walk the grounds, make sure no one broke in, and lock up when the clock struck midnight. That particular night started like any other. The park had just closed, and I watched as the last of the visitors shuffled out. I grabbed my flashlight, ready to do my rounds. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of popcorn and engine grease. The attractions stood like silent giants under the dim glow of flickering streetlights. As I walked past the Ferris wheel, I heard it, a faint creak, like metal shifting under strain. I stopped, shining my flashlight toward the ride. It wasn't uncommon for the wind to rattle the old rides, but something felt off. The Ferris wheel wasn't just creaking, it was moving. At first, I thought it must have been the wind or maybe a mechanical glitch. I walked closer, my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. The Ferris wheel turned slowly, almost deliberately, its groans echoing in the empty park. Then I noticed the cabins. They weren't empty. Figures sat inside them, motionless and dark, their forms barely visible through the grime-covered glass. My heart skipped a beat as I strained to see more clearly. Something about them wasn't right. They didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't even breathe. "Hello," I called out, my voice wavering. No response. Just the slow, rhythmic creak of the wheel. As I stood there, frozen in place, one of the cabins stopped at the bottom. The door opened with a soft click, and a figure stepped out. My flashlight beam caught it, a tall, humanoid shape with no discernible face, just a smooth surface where features should have been. I stumbled back, my chest tightening. Another cabin stopped, another figure emerged. Then another. A low, guttural voice filled the air, resonating from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You will join us tonight." Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the pavement. The figures didn't chase me. They didn't need to. I could feel their presence behind me, relentless and inescapable. I sprinted through the park, my flashlight bouncing erratically in my grip. The attractions loomed like specters in the dark, their rusted frames casting grotesque shadows. Behind me, I could feel them, those faceless figures, following silently. The carousel was ahead, its chipped paint glinting faintly under the flickering streetlights. I darted past it, hoping the maze of rides and stalls would slow them down. My breath was ragged, and every step felt heavier, but the fear kept me moving. I turned a corner and ducked into the House of Mirrors, slamming the door shut behind me. Inside, the air was cold and stale, the silence oppressive. The faint glow of my flashlight reflected endlessly in the glass, creating a dizzying labyrinth of light and shadow. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then I saw them. At first, it was just a glimpse, a flicker of movement in one of the mirrors. I turned, but there was nothing behind me. Then it happened again, this time closer. The reflections of the faceless figures began to appear in every mirror, surrounding me. Panic set in as I stumbled through the maze, the glass walls disorienting me further. The figures didn't move like humans. Their jerky, unnatural motions were a mockery of life. I could feel their presence closing in, the air growing colder with each passing second. Desperation drove me forward, my hands groping for an exit. My flashlight dimmed, its beam flickering as if it, too, was succumbing to the oppressive atmosphere. Finally, I found a door and burst through it, collapsing onto the ground outside. The air outside was heavy, but it was a relief to be out of the house of mirrors. I looked around, hoping to find a clear path to the exit, but my heart sank. The figures were still there, emerging from the shadows like predators stalking their prey. The carousel was nearby, its gaudy lights flickering weakly. I ran toward it, hoping the elevated platform would give me a vantage point to spot the exit. The ride was still and silent, its once lively music replaced by an eerie hum. I climbed onto the platform, my legs trembling. From there, I could see the park's entrance, but it felt impossibly far away. As I scanned the area, the voice returned, low and guttural. "You cannot leave." The figures began to gather around the carousel, their movements synchronized as if controlled by a single entity. They didn't need to rush, they knew I had nowhere to go. The carousel lights flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. My breath caught as I heard the creak of the ride starting to turn. The platform beneath me began to move, and I realized the figures were climbing onto the carousel animals, their faceless heads turning toward me. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. All I knew was that I had to get off the carousel before it was too late. With every ounce of strength I had left, I jumped off the moving platform and ran toward the exit, ignoring the burning pain in my legs and the icy presence at my back. The exit was in sight, a faint glimmer of hope amid the oppressive darkness. I didn't dare look back. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but the fear coursing through me pushed me forward. The figures were relentless. Though I couldn't hear their footsteps, I could feel their presence closing in. The low hum of the carousel faded into the distance, replaced by an eerie silence that made my pounding heartbeat seem deafening. The gates of the park loomed ahead, their rusted metal framing the way to freedom. But as I approached, the voice returned, louder and more insistent than before. "You cannot leave. You are one of us now." I stumbled, nearly falling, as the words reverberated through my skull. For a moment, it felt as though invisible hands were pulling me back, trying to drag me into the darkness. "No!" I screamed, forcing myself to keep going. My vision blurred with tears, but I could see the faint glow of streetlights beyond the gates. With one final surge of energy, I reached the entrance and hurled myself through. The moment I crossed the threshold, the oppressive weight lifted. The silence was replaced by the faint hum of crickets and distant traffic. I turned back, expecting to see the figures chasing me, but the park was still. The lights had gone out completely, and the ride stood motionless, as if nothing had ever happened. I don't remember how I got home that night. The adrenaline must have carried me far enough to flag down a passing car, but the details are hazy. What I do remember is the lingering dread, the feeling that I had escaped something I was never meant to understand. I quit my job at the park the very next day. I didn't even return to collect my last paycheck. The thought of stepping foot in that place again was unbearable. Years have passed since that night, but the memories remain sharp. Every now and then, when I drive past an abandoned amusement park, I feel it again, that sensation of being watched. It's as though the figures are still out there, waiting for me to return. I've told this story to a few people over the years, but no one believes me. They laugh, chalking it up to an overactive imagination or a bad dream. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And if you ever find yourself alone in an old amusement park at midnight, and you hear a ride moving on its own, don't investigate. Don't wait to see what's inside. Run. Because some places were never meant to be disturbed. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.